It was nearing evening, and I was tidying my room when I heard a door squeak behind me. Turning, I saw Alden in the entryway. Gazing at what I held, my heart leaped into my throat. How could I explain this? The item was anything but harmless. A big, colorful sex toy. There was no way to politely ignore it. I'd taken it from a drawer to clean a cupboard, without a second thought. I'd locked the door, or so I believed. Alden, my 23-year-old stepson, wasn't expected home yet. He had a job. He worked at the nearby brewery, often staying out late with pals. He was tall and thin, dark hair falling over playful blue eyes. "What's that?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and teasing. I blushed furiously, dropping the object as if it burned. Grabbing a cushion, I hid it. "It's none of your business," I mumbled, my throat tight. His face didn't change. If anything, he leaned against the door, more interested. "You don't need to be so shy," he smirked. "It's not like I haven't seen this before." I felt like disappearing. The sheer embarrassment was overwhelming. I wished I could vanish. Audacity of this kid. Well, man, really to stand there so casually, completely unfazed while my world spun out of control? I forced a laugh, desperate to diffuse the attention. "Alden, seriously, go mind your own business. You shouldn't even be in here." But he didn't move for a moment. There was silence between us, heavy and almost unbearable. He wasn't looking at them. Pillow in my hands anymore. He was looking at me. His gaze was different, not the usual laid-back or playful glances I was used to. This one lingered too long, too intently. It was as if he'd peeled back a layer of the person he thought I was, and found someone else entirely. I felt something strange at. Flicker of warmth, deep in my chest, followed by a sharp pang of guilt. This was wrong, whatever this was. It was absolutely wrong. I was his stepmother, for God's sake. I was married to his father. I shook my head and broke the silence. "Please." "Alden, just go." He finally shrugged, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "All right," he said, his tone light again. But before he left, he gave me one last look, a look that set my already unsettled thoughts into overdrive. As the door closed behind him, I sat down on the edge of the bed, the pillow still clutched against my chest. My heart was racing. I couldn't even bring myself to put the item back into the drawer. It felt like something invisible had shifted in the air between us, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I knew I'd never see Alden the same way again for the rest of the evening. I couldn't shake the moment from my mind. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, and even sat next to Victor on the couch while he flipped through old westerns on the TV. But Alden's face, that amused smirk, and the TV smirk, and the used smirk, unsettling glint in his eyes, haunted me. Victor barely noticed my distraction. That was nothing new. He'd been wrapped up in his hobbies, gardening, woodworking, crossword puzzles for years now. Ever since his retirement, I didn't resent him for it. That would have been too easy. But sometimes I felt like more of a live-in caretaker than a wife. At one point, I glanced down the hall and caught Alden's shadow as he moved around in his room. I could hear the faint hum of music coming through his door, a low bass line that didn't match the quiet stillness of the rest of the house. My heart jumped for no reason I could justify, and I turned my attention back to my husband. Victor was snoring softly, his chin tilted down toward his chest. He'd fallen asleep in his recliner again, the TV still droning on. I thought about waking him, but what would be the point? Instead, I stood and wandered into the kitchen, grateful for a moment of solitude. But I wasn't alone for long. Alden walked in his bare feet, quiet against the hardwood floor. He wore a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. His hair, 'tis like he'd just run his hands through. "Hey," he said, casually opening the fridge and grabbing a bottle of water. "You're up late." "I could say the same about you," I replied, keeping my tone light. He smiled, leaning against the Kier counter, just unwinding. "You know, it's not easy being under this roof." Sometimes the comment made me pause. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, but there was a hint of something serious in his expression. "It's nothing, just living here again. I guess I feel like I don't fit anymore. I softened at that. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of maternal concern. "It's just temporary. Alden, you'll figure things out. You're smart and capable. You'll land on your feet." "Thanks, Melina," he said, his voice quieter. "Now, I appreciate that." For a moment we stood in silence. The kitchen felt smaller somehow. The space between us shrinking, even though neither of us moved his eyes, lingered on mine, and I felt that same flicker of warmth in my chest again. I cleared my throat and busied myself, wiping the counter, desperate to break whatever spell was threatening to take hold. But Alden wasn't finished about. "Earlier," he started, his tone turning playful again. "You don't have to be embarrassed. We're all human, right?" My hand froze mid-wipe and I turned to him, trying to keep my composure. "Alden, let's not talk about that, all right? It was an accident, and it's not worth bringing up again, okay?" he said, raising his hands in surrender, but there was a teasing edge in his smile that made my stomach flip. He walked past me, then close enough that I caught a faint whiff of his cologne. I didn't turn around, but I could feel his presence behind me for a moment before he finally left the kitchen that night. As I lay in bed next to Victor, my mind raced what was happening to me, to this house. I'd always been able to maintain clear boundaries lines that weren't meant to be crossed. But Alden had a way of bending those lines even when he wasn't trying to. And the worst part was I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop the next morning. I tried to act normal. I prepared breakfast like I always did, eggs, toast, and coffee for Victor, a smoothie for myself. Alden was the last to come into the kitchen as usual, his hair still damp from a shower. He greeted Victor with a casual morning and me with a warm smile that made my pulse quicken. The three of us sat at the table, the clinking of silverware and occasional snippets of conversation filling the air. But underneath it all, I could feel the tension every time Alden's hand brushed mine as we passed the salt or refilled coffee. It felt deliberate. I caught him watching me more than once, his gaze steady and unreadable. Victor, of course, noticed none of this. After breakfast, Alden offered to help me clean up. Normally, he would have disappeared into his room or out with friends, so his offer caught me off guard. "You don't have to," I said, stacking plates in the sink. "I want to." He replied already. Grabbing a dish rag, we worked in silence for a while, but the air between us felt charged at one point. I reached for a glass at the same time he did, and our hands collided. Neither of us pulled away immediately. "You're different," he said quietly, his voice just above a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know. You don't act like other women your age." I laughed nervously, stepping back to create some distance. "Well, that's flattering. I suppose it's not just that." He continued, his tone serious. "Now, you're real. You actually listen. You see people." The sincerity in his voice took me off guard. I didn't know what to say, so I turned back to the dishes. But as I scrubbed, I felt his presence close behind me. My heart was racing again, and I hated how much I wanted him to stay there. Before I could gather my thoughts, Victor's voice called from the living room. "Melina, where's my crossword book?" The moment shattered and Alden stepped back, giving me a small, knowing smile. "I'll let you get back to him," he said, his voice light again as he walked away. I felt a mix of relief and longing. I knew I was playing with fire, but some part of me couldn't help but reach for the heat that afternoon. I busied myself with errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But when I returned home, I found Alden sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the yard. He looked lost in thought, a far cry from the confident young man I was used to seeing. "Hey," I said softly as I approached. He looked up, his face breaking into a small smile. "Hey, everything all right?" He hesitated before answering. "Yeah, just thinking about, what about life? I guess where I'm headed, where I should be headed." I sat down beside him, keeping a safe distance, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. "You're young, Alden. You don't have to have it all figured out yet." "Maybe," he said, his gaze still fixed on the yard. Then, after a pause, he added, "You ever feel like you're meant for something different, like you're trapped in the wrong story?" His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay. But the truth was, I didn't believe that myself. Instead, I placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently. "You're not trapped," I said, hoping he wouldn't notice the tremor in my voice. For a moment, he covered my hand with his, and the gesture felt impossibly intimate. I pulled away quickly. But the damage was done. Another line crossed, another boundary blurred, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to stop it anymore. That evening, the sky turned dark with an oncoming storm. The air hung heavy, as though the world itself was waiting for something to happen. Victor had gone to bed early, as he often did, complaining about an aching shoulder. I had settled into the living room, a book in hand, but I couldn't focus. The storm outside mirrored the one building. Within me, something restless, unpredictable, and dangerous. Alden was in the kitchen. The sound of the fridge opening and closing, carrying through the quiet house. I could hear the faint clink of glass as he poured himself a drink. Moments later, he appeared in the doorway of the living room, holding 2 glasses. "Whiskey?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I blinked, caught off guard. "I don't usually drink this late." "Well, maybe tonight's an exception," he said with a grin, handing me a glass without waiting for an answer. I hesitated, but took it, the cool glass pressing against my palm. Alden sank into the armchair across from me. Stretching his legs out casually, the lamp beside me cast a warm glow across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the faint shadow of stubble on his chin. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book in my lap. Just nodding toward the book in my lap. "Just something light," I replied, holding it up briefly. "Nothing exciting," he smirked. "I find that hard to believe." I laughed softly, taking a sip of the whiskey. It burned, but it was a welcome distraction from the tension that had been building all day. For a while, we sat in comfortable silence, the storm outside growing louder. But then he spoke again, his voice low. "Can I ask you something?" I glanced at him warily. "Depends on what it is." He swirled the liquid in his glass, his eyes fixed on it as though he were gathering his thoughts. "Do you ever feel stuck?" His question startled me. It was eerily similar to the one he'd asked earlier on the porch, but now there was a different weight to it. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. He looked up, then his eyes meeting mine. "You don't seem like someone who should be stuck. You're too alive for that." I felt my cheeks flush, and I looked away, setting my glass down on the coffee table. "Alden, you shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "It's true." His words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. I stood abruptly, needing to put space between us. "I think it's time we called it a night," I said, avoiding his gaze. But before I could leave the room, the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and I froze mid-step. "Oh," I muttered, my voice shaky. "It's just the storm," Alden said, his tone calm. I heard him stand the soft shuffle of his feet on the carpet. "Hold on. I'll find a flashlight." I heard him move closer, the faint rustle of fabric as he passed me. Then his hand brushed against mine in the dark, and I sucked in a sharp breath. "Sorry," he murmured, but he didn't pull away. His hand lingered warm against mine, and the air between us seemed to shift. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. "Melina," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I turned toward him, even though I couldn't see him in the dark, but I could feel him. His presence, his warmth, his steady breathing, and then his hand slid up to my wrist, holding it gently. "This is a bad idea," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied, but he didn't let go. The first crack of lightning lit up the room for a brief second, and in that moment I saw his face earnest, vulnerable, and impossibly close. And then he kissed me. The kiss was soft, at first tentative, as though he was waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands gripping his shirt, as though he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. When the lights flickered back on, we broke apart, both of us, breathing hard. The reality of what we'd just done hit me like a wave, and I stepped back, my hands trembling. "This can't happen," I said, shaking my head. Alden didn't argue. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said again, his voice steady, but the damage was done. The next few days were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. I avoided Alden as much as I could, throwing myself into chores and errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the feel of his lips on mine, or the way his hand had lingered on my wrist one evening. As I was folding laundry in the guest room, Alden appeared in the doorway. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. I didn't look up. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. I sighed, setting the laundry down, and finally meeting his gaze. "Alden, this, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's wrong," is it? He asked, his tone challenging, "because it doesn't feel wrong to me." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You don't understand. If Victor ever found out, he won't." Alden interrupted. "And even if he did do, you really think he'd care? He barely notices you. The more he think he'd care, he barely notices you anymore." His words stung, partly because they were true, but that didn't make them right. "This isn't about him," I said, my voice rising. "It's about us, about the fact that this, whatever this is, it can't happen. It's not just wrong. It's impossible." Alden took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine. "Why?" "Because you're afraid of what people might think. Because you're afraid of what you might think." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Melina," he continued, his voice softer now, "I'm not trying to make this harder for you, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you, and I don't think you can either." I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away. "You don't understand," I whispered. "Then explain it to me," he said, his tone pleading. But I couldn't. I couldn't explain the war raging inside me, the guilt, the fear, the longing. So instead, I shook my head and pushed past him, leaving the room without another word. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft, soft hum of Victor's breathing. Beside me, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, none of which I could untangle. At some point, I got up and went to the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would help calm my nerves. But as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Alden's door was open, and he was standing there, leaning against the doorframe, as though he'd been waiting for me. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, unable to find my voice for a long moment. We just stared at each other, the silence between us, heavy and charged, and then without thinking, I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, I knew this wasn't over, whatever this was, this impossible, dangerous thing between us. It wasn't going away, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to the next time it happened. There wasn't a storm to blame nor a flickering light to hide behind this time. It was deliberate. It started in the laundry room, of all places. I was pulling warm towels from the dryer. The mundane rhythm of folding them, offering some kind of escape. The house was quiet. Victor had gone to a friend's house to watch a game, and I thought I had the place to myself. Then I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. "Always working," Alden said, his voice light but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I didn't turn around. "Someone has to," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He chuckled softly. "Fair enough. But don't you ever get tired of it? Tired of what? Taking care of everything, taking care of everyone. When's the last time someone took care of you?" His words cut through me like a knife. I turned, then clutching a folded towel against my chest like a shield. "Alden, I don't think this is a conversation we should be having." "Why not?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. He looked so at ease, so unbothered, but his eyes told a different story. They were sharp, searching, and impossibly focused on me, because I said, my voice faltering, "It's not appropriate." He repeated, as though testing the word that's not the same as honest. "Though, is it?" I wanted to argue to shut him down before he could say anything else that would make this worse. But before I could, he stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "You don't have to pretend with me, Melina," he said softly. "I see you. I see the way you carry this house, the way you keep everything together while everyone else just takes. Don't you think you deserve something for yourself?" My throat tightened, and I shook my head, stepping back until I felt the edge of the counter against my hips. "Alden, this, whatever this is, it has to stop." He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small, simple gesture, but it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out, because I couldn't tell him that I couldn't lie to him or to myself. And then, just like that night in the living room, he kissed me, but this time I didn't stop him. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered secrets. We were careful, or at least we thought we were. Alden was good at finding excuses to linger in the same room as me, offering to help with dinner, fixing a broken cabinet door even, volunteering to run errands with me. At first it was thrilling, the rush of something forbidden, but the reality of our situation weighed heavily on me. I knew it couldn't last. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. One afternoon, as I was putting away groceries, Alden came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I stiffened, glancing toward the doorway to make sure no one was there. "Alden," I hissed, trying to pull away. "We could walk in." I hissed, trying to pull away. "I could walk in any minute. He was at the hardware store," Alden said, his voice calm. "Relax." But I couldn't relax. Not anymore. The paranoia was starting to eat away at me. Every time Victor looked at me, I wondered if he knew. Every time Bethany, our nosy neighbor, waved at me from across the street, I felt like she could see right through me. "We need to talk," I said, turning to face Alden. "About what?" he asked, his expression unable about this, about us. His jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. "What about us? This has to stop," I said, forcing the words out. "It's too risky. It's not fair to Victor, fair to Victor." "Victor," he repeated, his voice rising. "What about fair to you? Do you even hear yourself? You're so busy worrying about him that you don't even think about what you want." "What I want doesn't matter," I snapped. "It's not about me. That's not a right. I understand back. You deserve to be happy, Melina. You deserve to be happy, Melina. You deserve to be with someone who actually sees you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't, because deep down I knew he was right. The breaking point came a few weeks later. Victor had invited Bethany and her husband over for dinner, and I was doing my best to play the role of the perfect hostess. But Bethany's sharp eyes seemed to be on me all night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something. After dinner, as I was cleaning up in the kitchen, Bethany cornered me. "You've been awfully distracted lately," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes probing, "Just busy," I replied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." She leaned in, slightly lowering her voice. "Does Victor know?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Know what?" She shrugged, her expression unreadable. "Whatever's going on with you and Alden." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking. Bethany smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just be careful. Melina's secrets have a way of coming out that night." As I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying Bethany's words in my mind. I felt trapped, caught between two worlds that couldn't coexist. The next morning, Alden found me in the garden pulling weeds with more force than necessary. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice steady, but tinged with frustration. "I'm trying to protect us," I replied, not looking up. "Protect us from what?" he asked, stepping closer from this blowing up at our faces. I said, standing and wiping my hands on my jeans. "Bethany knows Alden. She knows." He frowned, his expression darkening. "How could she know?" "I don't know. But she does," I said, my voice rising. "And if she tells Victor, she won't," he said firmly. "You don't know that I snapped you. Don't understand how dangerous this is." Alden grabbed my hand, his grip strong, but not painful. "What I understand is that I don't want to lose you." The raw emotion in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. "You won't," I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But we have to be careful for both our sakes." The days that followed were tense. Bethany didn't say anything to Victor, at least not that I knew of, but the weight of her suspicion hung over me like a cloud. Alden tried to reassure me, but even he seemed more on edge than usual. Then one evening, Victor came home earlier than expected. I was in the laundry room with Alden, the two of us standing closer than we should have been when we heard the front door open. We sprang apart like guilty teenagers. Victor called my name, his voice carrying through the house in here. I replied, my voice steady, despite the panic rising in my chest. Victor appeared in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the room for a moment. I thought he was going to say something, but then he just nodded. "Dinner ready." "Almost," I said quickly. He left without another word. But the look he gave me lingered long after he was gone that night. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in the laundry room, the way Victor's eyes had lingered on me, just a second too long. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to end it. Whatever this was between Alden and me, it felt too big, too consuming to simply walk away from. But deep down, I knew the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. It started with Victor coming home unexpectedly early. But this time it wasn't just the timing that caught me off guard. His face was tight, his expression unreadable as he stepped into the house and set his briefcase down with a deliberate thud. Alden Victor called, his voice sharp enough to make my stomach drop. Alden appeared in the hallway. Moments later, his casual demeanor contrasting Victor's obvious tension. "What's up?" he asked, leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets. Victor's eyes narrowed. "We need to talk now." The tone in his voice left no room for argument. Alden glanced at me briefly, concern flickering in his eyes, before following Victor into the living room. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my heart pounding. I couldn't hear their words at first, just the low rumble of Victor's voice and the occasional quieter responses from Alden. But as their conversation escalated, the words became clear. "I know what's been going on," Victor said, his voice like ice. "What are you talking about?" Alden replied, his tone calm but guarded. "Don't play dumb with me," Victor snapped. "I've seen